it's Lara here from the Community Programs team at the South Australian Museum. And today I'm going to share a fabric dyeing activity with you, which you might like to try at home. Like most of you, our team is staying home a lot more at the moment to help keep our community safe, but we're really missing having the chance to share hands-on activities and programs with our visitors. All of these activities are inspired by the objects, belongings, specimens and stories from the collections at the South Australian Museum. Today's activity takes its inspiration from one of my personal favourite displays at the museum in recent times, and that's the Yuendumu batiks, which are on display in the Australian Aboriginal Cultures Gallery. They really made me stop and think about the way that the colours and patterns in our clothes can be part of how we express ourselves, but also to question where those colours and patterns come from, and often the answer is through dyeing processes. Batik is an Indonesian technique for dyeing and creating patterns on fabric, although it's now used all over the world. And basically it uses wax, which is applied to undyed cloth. And when the cloth is then placed into the dye, the wax resists the dye or sort of pushes it away. So later when you remove the wax from the fabric, you can create beautiful patterns. Usually the wax is applied by sort of drawing or painting it onto the fabric, but you can also use a copper stamp to create repeat patterns on fabric. Now, a good question is, how did the technique of batik travel from Indonesia to the deserts of Central Australia? I asked my colleague Alice, the museum's Senior Collection Manager of Anthropology, how this happened, and she explained that in 1971, workshops were run at Ernabella to teach the technique to local Aboriginal women artists. And from Ernabella, batik spread to other desert communities, eventually arriving in Yuendumu, where it led to the creation of vibrant lengths of fabric and clothing which were created by Warlpiri women. So for today's activity, I'm set up here in my kitchen at home. There's a few birds singing outside which you might hear, and we're going to try a different type of resist dyeing technique. We're going to have a go at tie dyeing using turmeric, which is a natural dye. Some people say turmeric, I'm never quite sure which one it is, but it's a beautiful golden coloured spice, and then when it's used to dye light coloured fabrics, it turns them anywhere from a pale lemon through to a rich kind of marigold orange colour. If you're trying this activity at home and you're not a grown-up yourself, it's probably a good idea to ask a grown-up for some help, because we will need to use some hot water and also put a pan on the stove at one point. Turmeric can be a little bit messy, which is part of what makes it such a good dye, but it is useful to have a rag on hand and clean up any spills or drips quickly as you're working. Like many natural dyeing processes, your quantities don't need to be too specific here. So if you have a little bit less than what I'm recommending, you'll probably be fine. You can experiment, and the main difference you'll find is the depth of colour in the dye piece that you produce at the end. The materials and equipment you'll need for this activity are 3 to 4 pieces of natural fibre fabric, such as cotton, linen, silk or wool, 4 tablespoons of ground turmeric, rubber bands, string or pegs, white vinegar, a kettle, access to running water and a sink, a saucepan, a large bowl, tongs or a wooden spoon, a rag for cleanup, and you may also like to wear an apron or gloves while you're working. So the first step in the process is to prepare your dry fabric for dyeing. And this is where you could use the pegs, string or rubber bands to try different techniques. So this piece I folded like a concertina, and then I've put pegs on at different points. This one is more of a traditional tie-dye technique where I've bunched together little clumps of the fabric and then wrapped rubber bands around. And this piece, which was my biggest piece, I rolled up into a spiral, and then I've tied the string all the way around it in crisscrossing patterns. Okay, the next step is to mix together hot water and vinegar. So in my large mixing bowl, I've boiled a kettle, and I'm going to add about 4 cups of hot water. Or you want to make sure you can do different quantities, but for every 1 cup of vinegar that you add, you want to add about 4 cups of water. So I'm just going to keep to that 1-to-4 ratio. Here we go. Don't forget to get a grown-up to help you with this if boiling the kettle is not something you can easily do yourself. Right, so I'm adding in 1 cup of white vinegar. I'm just going to use my tongs to gently mix it together. And then the next step is to add your fabric pieces into this mixture so that they'll really soak up the liquid. I'm going to use the tongs because it's quite hot. And take your time as you go, because you really do want that water to soak all the way into the fabric Mine's sending up some little air bubbles as it gets drenched. Now, some people would not do this step, but the vinegar and water mixture will help the fabric later to really absorb the turmeric dye. You can leave it in here for as little as 10 to 15 minutes. You could soak it for up to an hour, and sometimes people even would have this on a slow simmer on the stove. But I'm going to leave mine for 15 minutes and come back and get it ready for the next step. While you're waiting for the soaking to happen, you can start to prepare your turmeric dye. So to make the dye, I'm going to add my 4 tablespoons of turmeric into a saucepan that has about 4 cups of water in it. Now you can, if you like, mix a bit of water slowly into the powder before you add it in so it doesn't form clumps, or you can just go for it, and later when the water warms up, it'll help kind of blend everything together. So I'm tipping in my turmeric, and I'm just going to use the end of my tongs to give it a little bit of a mix. Already turned a really beautiful orangey yellow colour. The next step, again with help from a grown-up, is to put the saucepan onto the stove, bring it almost up to a boil, and then turn the heat down and bring it to a simmer. So while the turmeric dye is heating up on your stove, if it's been 10 or 15 minutes or more, depending on how long you want to soak your fabric, it's time to take the fabric out of the vinegar and water mix. Just be careful if it's still warm of your fingers. Mine's cooled down enough that I can pull it out by hand. And I'm just going to wring it out. We don't want it to be sopping wet when it goes into the dye bath, just kind of damp all the way through. It's a bit harder to wring out when there's spiky pegs all over it. So once your turmeric dye has come almost to the boil and then come down to a simmer, you can add in these fabric pieces. You've got 2 options. You can leave it gently simmering away on the stove and add them in there, in which case make sure you're really careful and use your tongs, or you can take it off the heat and add them in without using the stove, and that's what I'm going to do, so I'll go and get my dye now. After letting my dye simmer for about 15 minutes, I've taken it off the heat and brought it over here onto a chopping board, and as I said before, you could choose at this stage to let it keep simmering. And I've placed inside, I don't know if you can see, I'll use the tongs, my fabric pieces. And they've actually been soaking now for about 30 minutes. And as I said, you can leave them for as long as you like. Some people leave them for an hour, some people might only give it 10 minutes. But I'm ready to take them out carefully because the liquid's still hot. And then it's going to be time to head to the laundry sink. And there you're going to need to wash them under running water until that water runs clear. Now you might notice some of the turmeric colour is washing out of the fabric. That's completely normal. I promise there'll be something left at the end when you've rinsed them out. Here we go. This is probably the stage where you also need to be most careful to try not to make a mess. Got my handy cleaning rag nearby. The last one. I'm off to my laundry to rinse these pieces out, and then coming up next is the most exciting part. We're going to remove the pegs, the rubber bands and the string and see what patterns have been created on the fabric. Let's start with the pegs. So there's some interesting little squares underneath where the peg was pinching on the fabric. Probably needs an extra little wring out to get the moisture from the laundry out. Still a tiny bit of turmeric colouring coming out, but the pegs were the hardest ones to rinse. You can always give these another wash later. So the pegs have created some beautiful square and rectangular patterns on the fabric. I'm pretty happy with that one. I'm going to try the tie-dye bundles now, which means pulling off the rubber bands. It's a bit fiddly, I think I put them on pretty tight. But you want a bit of pressure because that's also going to stop the dye from getting into the sections underneath, and it will create the white patterns that are starting to appear now. So the tie-dye bundles have created beautiful circular shapes, and I think I almost got an accidental heart shape down on the bottom of this one. You might notice there's a little bit of the grainy turmeric still on this bit of fabric. So again, you can just give that a second wash in the sink. And then last of all, I'm going to cut the string from this bigger piece. This was the piece that I rolled all the way up. So I'm interested to see whether the pattern is just on the outside or whether it's made it into the middle. I think this one might be a slightly more delicate pattern. So unrolling. Oh, I can definitely see some of the crisscross pattern of the string. So different patterns on the outside of the fabric to the inside. This has definitely helped me to stem my boredom, and now the final step is for me to go outside, give these one more quick wash and then hang them on the washing line and then decide what to make with them. Now, turmeric is a natural dye and it fades over time. So if you're ever washing it, just be really careful that you wash it with similar colours so you don't end up with yellow socks. And also you could use it for things like making a cushion cover, making a flag to fly in your garden, fabric hanging. I think I'm going to use mine as recyclable fabric wrapping paper. If you try this activity at home, we'd love to hear about it at the South Australian Museum, so share your results with us on our social media channels or send us an email and let us know what you made.